The buds are starting to burst open. It's a sign of spring. Well, on the show today we have for you some Wisconsin history. And more signs of spring here at Schmidt-Woodland Hills. There are daffodils popping up and tulips popping up. On the show we have Jim Draeger, who's an author and historian, and he's going to tell us about Wisconsin's historic bars and breweries.
Wisconsin History Makers Tour. We've got Jim Draeger, the author, is going to talk about Wisconsin historic bars and breweries, which seems appropriate for the building that we're in. So I'll turn it over to him. So thanks.
Thank you. I could stand up on the stage. How about that? Because this is sponsored by the Wisconsin Historical Society, they gave me this long list of things to read, which I'm not really going to read, but I'll tell you a little bit about them. I worked there for 32 years, so I feel I can just speak about the Historical Society. The History Makers Tour is a program that they established that travels through Wisconsin from now until February of 2027 to bring history to local communities through pop-up exhibits, object displays, speakers, that kind of thing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Wisconsin Historical Society, you probably should be. It's a remarkable institution. It was established in 1846. Anybody know when Wisconsin was established as a state? 1848, right, 2 years before Wisconsin became a state. They decided to establish a historical society so they could gather the history of the state. And that's one of the things that's made the Historical Society so amazing nationally. They have renowned collections. Working there 32 years, I was always surprised by the things that would come out of the archives or the library. It has one of the largest collections of North American history in the United States. It's second only to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Imagine that, little Wisconsin. They have the largest newspaper collection west of the Mississippi River. They have the fifth largest film library in the country. Universal Films, Dracula, Frankenstein, they own those. They own the Universal Studios catalog. They have a collection of that's just unsurpassed in so many subject areas. If you ever watch Ken Burns documentaries on public television, look for the Historical Society in the credits, because it's in there, in every one, because Ken Burns relies heavily on the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society. So it's really a remarkable institution. It's got over 290 million items. They have 5 million photos alone. And when you collect stuff, you don't collect it just to keep it, you collect it to share. That's the point of collecting it. And the Wisconsin Historical Society has been trying to increase the amount of that they're doing, and hence that's why I'm here today. But also, they're planning a new museum up on the square in Madison. I don't know if anybody goes up to the farmers market, but the old museum building is gone, and a new museum is under construction there in that spot. That's going to be a state-of-the-art museum. I was involved in the planning of that before I retired, but I just couldn't wait around until it was finally completed. So The wonderful thing about it, I think, is it's going to be state-of-the-art. It's going to have magnificent exhibits in there, and I've seen enough of the work ahead of time. I really believe it's going to be something fantastic. But they also want to develop it into a history hub to be able to connect to all the 72 counties in Wisconsin and to include traveling exhibits that could come to places like Richland Center, digital outreach, digital programming, all of that kind of stuff, and they hope to have that open. Well, they will have it open in 2027. So, we're just a couple years away from having a really great Wisconsin History Museum. And last of all, I want to give their thanks to Culver's and to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for supporting this tour. Oh, and then they want me to say that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speaker. You bet they are. You're going to hear it. So, let's just jump right in. When we put this book together, I was approached by the Wisconsin Historical Society. They asked me if I'd go to a meeting to talk about a possible book on Wisconsin taverns. They thought it was an interesting topic that deserved, Wisconsin's a tavern state, right? We want to celebrate that. So they asked me to come to this meeting. I talked for an hour and a half about what I thought a book about bars should be about in Wisconsin. And one of the things I told them right off the bat is we have to talk about breweries. If you don't tell the story of breweries, you're missing a huge part of the history of taverns because they're intertwined. Sometimes they were the same. So if you want to tell one story, you got to tell them both. And I told them that I wanted to format it in a way that people could learn about the history of taverns and breweries in Wisconsin over time, but then they could actually go and see taverns and breweries that are really exceptional. So we decided to include 15 breweries and 55 taverns in the book that would get special treatment in the book. They each got a 2-page spread. And so we had to find 55 taverns in Wisconsin. I know that's hero's work, isn't it? So on the weekends I'd say to my wife, I'm going out researching. And Mark and I would go out and we would travel to as many taverns as we could in a day. Secret tip, if you're writing a book about taverns, don't drink at them. Because you'll never get your book done. On our biggest day, we went to 28 taverns in one day. So we visited many taverns, and I started out by making a list of 25 taverns I thought were really top-notch that I already knew in the state. In my job, I was the State Historic Preservation Officer of Wisconsin, and in my job, I traveled the state extensively. And it meant that over 32 years, I'd seen a lot of great taverns. And so I made a list of them, and this one here was on the list. It happened to be in my hometown, which is Oconto, Wisconsin. And when I was growing up, it was called the OK Tavern. Sounds like a perfect Wisconsin name, right? How's that tavern? Okay. It means it's really good, right? We're not boastful. So it was a really good place, and my dad owned a feed mill right behind it. And on Fridays, we'd jump in the car and drive to the mill with my mom, and then we'd go in the OK Tavern and we'd eat a fish fry, and I'd drink a grape soda, eat a candy bar. And I knew it was still pretty original, that it hadn't been altered very much, because we were looking for taverns that no matter when they were built, they were original to when they were built, so when you walked inside them, you could really get a sense of what a historic tavern looked like. And so we visited it. It was great. It still had its tin ceiling. It had this beautiful bar set with this elaborate back bar, front bar. So I contacted the local history guy in town. There's always somebody that has all this stuff, right? Name was Dick Thorne. I sent him an email. I said, Dick, do you have any pictures of the OK Tavern? He said, yeah, I've got a few. I'll scan them and I'll send them to you. So one day I'm in the office and I get an email from Dick and I open it up and I see this photo and I see my grandfather. Surprise, surprise. My grandfather was an iceman, and you can see he's holding his ice tongs in his hands. And then his brother Hank is standing next to him, and he has his ice tongs slung over the shoulder. And obviously they're making an ice delivery to the tavern. It just happened to be there when the photographer's there to take the picture, and they got in on the picture. That just shows you that you never know what you're going to find when you're researching. Doing historical research is wonderful. It's like, it's such a rush when you find something really great that you dig up. And that was really something excellent for me. My favorite thing about this map is that people laugh before I even explain it. Seems self-explanatory, right? What it is it is looking at the ratio of grocery stores to taverns in the United States by census district. So if you have more taverns than grocery stores in your census district, you're red. Can anybody see Wisconsin on this?
It's a big
Here's the funny little thing is Richland Center is right over there with that gold part. So I'm glad to be in Richland Center talking about taverns. So I got this map. I thought, this is why I'm writing this book. This map must be explained. So we're going to start in on the explaining part. Why Wisconsin, right? Why did Wisconsin become a tavern state? At the turn of the century, the three largest breweries in the world were located in Wisconsin. We're going to name them, okay? Pabst?
Miller?
Nope, not Miller. Miller didn't become big until after World War II.
Val Blatt.
Blatz. Okay, we have Pabst and Blatz.
Schlitz.
Schlitz. Those are the big three. And Schlitz and Pabst vied for number one, fought back and forth for almost 100 years. So what makes Wisconsin such a great place for breweries? Well, there are a number of different factors. In the earliest days of breweries, all breweries were microbreweries, right? What we call craft breweries today, they all were craft breweries. They were all locally based. Their beer was consumed typically within 30 miles of where it was produced. And not only that, all of the ingredients that went into the beer were local too. So they raised their own barley, they raised their own hops. If you drive to Milwaukee, you drive past Pabst Farms. What was Pabst Farms? It was the farms of the Pabst Brewery where they grew their barley. And so that meant you had to have great growing land, and that's something that Wisconsin has. And they also grew hops here, and that picture on the top left is a picture of people harvesting hops in Sauk County. And hops were had to be picked as soon as they ripened, because the hop, as we know it, is the flower of the vine. And the reason why they use hops dates back to when they were discovered in the 16th century. They came from China. And they started adding hops to beer because it had two qualities that were really important in making beer. One, it was bitter. And as you all know, beer can be sweet, right? Especially if you drink like a stout beer. It's very, very sweet tasting. But that's residual sugar that's left over in the wort after the yeast have done their thing. And that residual sugar makes a beer sweet. Well, if you add hops to it, you can balance that sweetness, so it's not overly sweet. So when you talk about a good balanced beer, what we're really talking about is the residual sugar versus the hops in the beer. If there's a lot of hops, we call it hoppy. If it's rather sweet, then it's a porter or a stout beer. So they had to be picked quickly while before that hop dried up, because it's the oils in the hop that they're trying to capture. So when it was time to harvest the hops, which were grown at big poles, they still grow them that way today, they just use telephone poles and they grow up them. They would cut the vine down and then people would pick them off. And hop harvesting was typically done by women and children. You can see women in the front there, you can see there are actually some children in the back there. And it was kind of like all the families from the neighboring farm would come over and help them harvest that. They pack it in wooden crates, it would go off to the breweries. And Wisconsin was the largest hop producer in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. And it wasn't until hops became overproduced to the point that there was a collapse in the hops market, and farmers lost their farms, banks went bankrupt. It was really a huge event. And after it recovered again, by that time hops started to be produced in Washington State largely. And they never really came back to Wisconsin like they were originally. Another thing you need is water. Beer is mostly water, right? It's almost all water. And even though it's just water, the water has a great effect on the taste of the beer. And one of the things that gave Wisconsin a leg up is we have great water in Wisconsin. Those artesian wells, pure, wonderful water, and that made brewing so much better. And we had so much water that we leave it outside in the lakes, and in the winter, a miraculous thing happens. It turns from liquid to solid. And you can saw those blocks of ice out of the lakes, and then, as these guys are, and convey them off and use them in the brewing process. The brewers were, in Milwaukee, the brewery business was the second largest producer of, or user of ice in the city. Only the stockyards used more ice than the brewing business did. You needed ice throughout the entire process. You needed ice when you were aging the beer. You needed ice to control the temperature while the beer is being brewed, while it's fermenting. You want to ferment it at about 50 degrees at a steady temperature. And this is in the days before the kind of temperature controls we have today. So they would just put blocks of ice in the room. They throw sawdust on them. If it got too hot, they take sawdust off. If they needed to warm it up, they throw sawdust back on the ice, and that's how they regulated the temperature. And the temperature just sort of went like this. And 50 million tons of ice were consumed in a single year in Milwaukee in the brewing business. So it was enormous quantities of ice, and that gave Wisconsin a great leg up too. The last thing is that Wisconsin was uniquely centered to be a brewing state, and this is a railroad map of the United States, and there's Chicago right here. And if you look at all these lines snaking out, you can see they all radiate out of Chicago. Chicago is America's rail center, and that meant that you could brew your beer, get it on a train, and ship it anywhere in the United States. And by the 1870s, Pabst is already shipping beer to New York and San Francisco using the railroads. Well, why not Chicago, right? Why did Chicago become the brewing capital? Well, you've all heard that story about Mrs. O'Leary's cow, right? Kicks over a lantern in the barn and burns Chicago to the ground. And that, with it, the breweries burned as well. And then workers flooded into the city to rebuild it, and guess what? They get mighty thirsty. Can anybody tell me what the slogan of Schlitz was? Schlitz Brewing?
The beer that made Milwaukee famous.
The beer that made Milwaukee famous. Why did it make it famous? They gave free beer to workers in Chicago who came to rebuild the city. They had a parade in Milwaukee where the beer trucks, or the beer wagons came down the streets filled with kegs of beer. The horses were decorated. 25,000 people came out in the street to cheer on the breweries as they're heading down to the train depot with the beer that will save Chicago and make Milwaukee famous. The other thing it is a lot of drinkers. And Wisconsin had those too. Now, Wisconsin was settled by people who came from beer-loving cultures. They were the Germans, the Poles, the English, the Irish, the Czechs, people who came from cultures where beer was a part of the social and cultural mix of the communities. So it gave them a ready market here in Wisconsin. So we're going to switch beers a little bit. How is that?
Yeah.
We're going to switch gears here a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the tavern. You know, where does a tavern come from? When we were doing our research, we researched all the laws related, the state laws related to alcohol, and all the way back to 1839 to the territorial laws of Wisconsin. In 1839, they actually talk about taverns. And they say, a tavern must have an innkeeper of good moral repute, number one. Not sure how that was enforced. It must have at least 2 sleeping beds and a provender of hay for the horses. So you may wonder why they defined a tavern that way. It's because they were talking about stagecoach stops. The earliest taverns were stagecoach stops, and so you needed sleeping beds for the customers, you needed hay for the horses, and it was a way for them to regulate taverns, and that the tavern had to be a stagecoach stop at that point. And luckily for us, we still have one of those around. This is the Wade House. It's in a Greenbush between Sheboygan and Fond du Lac on the old stage road. And when it was established, it was built as a stagecoach house, and this was the tavern room. And fortunately, it ended up being well preserved, and this was tavern room was reconstructed. And what you can see about here that's notable is look at the tables and chairs and the games on the tables. But this is the front bar here, and this is the back bar. You notice there's no mirrors, there are no bottles. It's very, very plain. They didn't need bottles because all of the beer that was sold in here was produced by a local farmer. And he also distilled all the spirits too. So if you ordered a whiskey, and his bottle on the bar was empty, he'd go down to the basement and he'd refill it out of the keg and bring it back up again. And so they didn't need all of the apparatus that later taverns have. This place here survived long enough for us to include in the book, but sadly it's gone now. It's called the Israel Stoll Temperance House. And it was built in Delavan, Wisconsin. Delavan has a really interesting history because Delavan was founded by 2 brothers who are Yankees. And they had come to Wisconsin, bought 480 acres of land with the idea of creating a dry utopia. So I'm just going to let that sink in a minute. Where should I put my dry utopia? I think I'll choose Wisconsin. So they bought the land, they parceled it out. Every single lot in the city was deed restricted, saying you cannot consume, produce, or buy alcohol on the property. So it was a completely dry city. They went to a conference of temperance people, and they learned about something called a temperance house, which was just a stagecoach stop that was dry. Imagine that. And so they thought that was a great idea for the community. They gave Mr. Child land to build a temperance house, and he built this building as the temperance house in 1852, and they became disillusioned fairly quickly, and they decided to go back to the East Coast again, and within 5 years, Mr. Child's Temperance House became a wet tavern, and it continued as a wet tavern long into the future after that. So that's one of the places where taverns come from. The other place that informs the tavern is the general store. And you can see this in this picture down here on the side. There's a sign actually at the top above the doorway that says saloon, store and saloon. And under territorial law, you were allowed to have a sample room in your general store. This is a picture of a sample room here. And what a sample room was it was a place where you could, under Wisconsin law, you could sample up to a quart of your favorite beverage. Where are those sample rooms now, right? You're asking? You know, and why? Why did they do that? They did that because both beer and spirits were very inconsistent in this period. I talked to a craft brewer one day not too long ago, and he said, you know, anybody can brew a decent beer. He said the trick is to brew the same beer twice. If you can do it twice, you can become a brewer. And back in this time, as you can imagine, brewing is not the science that it is today. It was an art form. And they didn't even understand all the pieces. They didn't understand until the 1870s, the late 1870s, what yeast did. They knew you had to add it to the beer, and something magical happened when you add it, but they didn't know anything about the chemistry of yeast and what actually happened. And they didn't have temperature controls like we do today. They didn't have product controls. Even the weights and measures were inconsistent compared to the way we do things today. So it was hard to brew something that was consistent. And beer was sold, and hard liquor was sold by the keg. The bottled beer was super uncommon. So if you're going to buy a keg, you want to know what it tastes like first. So that's what the sample room was for. It was to sample that batch to determine whether it was something that you thought was drinkable or not before you went and bought a whole keg of it. So how did that change? You probably all know, I'm going to say someone's name right now that you're all going to know. Louis Pasteur. And why do we know Louis Pasteur? He invented pasteurization. You know what? Before he invented pasteurization, he studied yeast. He got a winery approached him, and the wine owner was like, please tell me why my batches of wine taste different. I can have the taste just locked in, and then the next batch is off. And tell me why that is. So he studied yeast, and we found out what yeast do is when you take, this is our quick lesson in brewing. If you're going to be a brewer, what you have to do is you raise some barley, you have to harvest the barley, and then you take the grain from the barley and you wet it down and you get it to sprout. They call that malting. So when you hear malt liquor, that's the malting. And what malting does is once that grain cracks open and the seed is ready to emerge, it has converted the starch of the grains into sugar. And the sugar is going to give energy to that plant as it's growing up. But we arrest that process, and then we take that grain and we grind it up, and we put it in with water, and we heat it up, and we make the wort of beer. But to get alcohol, you have to add yeast to that wort. And what the yeast do is they're hungry little buggers that go in there and they eat all of the sugar. And they eat sugar and they pee alcohol and fart CO2. So think about that the next time you're enjoying your beer. The next sip will be enriched by that description, I'm sure. So that's what the yeast do. And Louis Pasteur figured that out. And he also figured out how to keep a strain of yeast pure so it wouldn't get contaminated, because there's yeast in this room right now floating around. It's everywhere. And if wild yeast gets into your beer, it can change the taste of your beer. That's one of the reasons why things were so inconsistent in the beginning, is they had open fermentation and yeast could just fly in and colonize that wort and change the taste of it. So once they did that, things started becoming much more consistent, and you can see the power of that when in the early 1880s, Schlitz imports a lager yeast from Germany, and Pabst hires its first chemist. When a chemist joins your brewery, you know that things are changing, right? And what happened as a result of that is it allowed beer to be industrialized, and it could be produced in much greater quantity than it had in the past. And with the growth of the breweries came the growth of bartending as a profession. And in the 19th century, bartending was a white-collar job. It was considered very prestigious to be a bar owner or a bartender. They were powerful people. One of the reasons why bartending was considered such an important thing is in the 19th century, in the days before mass media, how did you find out what was going on in your community? You could read the paper, and that was about it. Otherwise, you talk to people, right? Who knows more than the bartender? If you want to know what's going on in town, because he hears it, or she, from everyone. So those people became powerful people. At one point, 45% of the city council of Milwaukee were bartenders, bar owners. 45%, almost the majority, were bar owners. One of the early governors of Wisconsin, Governor Rusk, was a tavern owner. So, in the late 19th century, they started writing helpful advice for bartenders, and this is the oldest version of a bartender's manual I could find. It was printed in 1888, and it was written by a guy named Harry Johnson. And one of the interesting things about this book is it gives you a glimpse into what being a bartender is about and what they thought was important. Like one of Harry's important pieces of information that he imparts is how to keep the flies out of your liquor bottles. You know, imagine, there are horses everywhere, there are flies everywhere, and when you pour out that shot of whiskey for your customer, you don't want a fly in the shot, right? So he explained how to keep those bottles hygienic, because we're just filling them up from the basement again at this point, right? So if you look at this illustration here, you see the business side of the bar, the side that you're on the other side of the bar looking this way. And you can see all of the bottles in there, and they're just labeled gin, whiskey, because there are no brands yet of alcohol. They just bought them from the local distiller. Nobody even knew which brands they were selling. There was no marketing of either beer or liquor that way. And over on the other side, you can see those fancy glasses there, and he's making alcoholic punches. You know, we think of cocktails as something that go back quite a ways, but they really don't. Cocktails, the earliest reference to a cocktail dates back to about 1827, and people didn't really drink cocktails even in the 19th century. Occasionally, but most guys just drank shot of beer, and at that time bars were just for men. Women were prohibited from bars in most places in this period of time, so it was a man's game. Over 90% of beer was sold out of a bar. So if you wanted beer to go, the way you got beer to go is you brought your pail to bar, and you have them fill a pail of beer for you, and then you can bring it home. Send the kids if you're too lazy. That was not illegal then. There was no drinking age, by the way. And how many of you have ever had a growler? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
You're my people. Yeah. Does anyone know where the name comes from? Growler. Why are they called growlers? Well, you see, you fill this pail up with beer and you put a lid on it to keep the flies out as you're walking home. And as you're walking along, that beer's sloshing in that pail and it's agitating it. And all that carbon dioxide is getting excited and it's bubbling up to the top and it's burping the lid and it's growling at you on your way home. So that's why we call them growlers. And I think it's interesting, we still use that today, right? And this guy over here you see on this boy, on the left-hand side, he's what they call the growler boy. And his job, he worked for the Tepper Iron Works in Milwaukee, and his job was to take all those pails down to the bar and get them filled with beer and brought back for the workers. So break time, lunch time, afternoon break, the growler boy would go out and do his stuff, and then they pay him, a little bit of money for doing that.
Were you drinking beer at the job?
Oh, yes, absolutely. People drank before, after, during. And if you think about it, some of those back-breaking jobs that those people had to do, I don't know how you could possibly have done them if you weren't drunk. So the growler boys were in the beer delivery business. You can see in this picture here, I looked at a lot of pictures of taverns. The Historical Society has hundreds of them. And one of the really interesting things, it wasn't uncommon to see a little boy sitting at the bar drinking a beer. He's got beer in his glass there. There was no drinking age, and children drinking beer was actually encouraged. Why would you encourage your kids to drink beer? Well, that was a nice benefit, right? They'd go to sleep, but that's not really why.
Safer than water.
Water was not healthy. Water could kill you. Water at this time was very unsafe. It was filled with bacteria that could cause deadly illnesses, and there were epidemics in cities that were caused by bad water. So because the water in beer had gone through a brewing process, it had killed off all the bad bacteria in the beer, and it made it safe to drink. So they actually even brewed beer to be consumed by women and children. They called it table beer. There's a brewery today that's making table beer, which I think is very interesting. It was about 2.5% alcohol. So like half of what a Bud would be today. So there was no drinking age, and there were really not many laws governing alcohol in the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, the breweries exploded in the 1880s, late 70s, 1880s. They exploded in size because of that industrialization I talked about, and because capital started flowing into breweries as well. English capital came and invested heavily in American breweries as they were building up. And so the breweries were rolling in money. But that didn't necessarily mean they were rolling in dough, because one of the problems that the breweries started to face is overproduction. There were so many breweries out there producing so much beer that it was driving the price of beer down. And the Civil War was paid for by a liquor tax. They taxed kegs of beer. Every keg was taxed $3.76 to pay for the Civil War. We just charge it on our grandchildren's credit cards now. So because of that, they had a lot of money they had a lot of money tied up in taxes, and the breweries wanted to sell a barrel of beer for $8. So a little less than half of that money would go to the federal government, and the rest of it would be their profit after their expenses. Well, the price of beer dropped as low as $4 a barrel. And the thing about beer is you can't just leave it around waiting for a better price, because that beer is going to go bad on you. And this is before pasteurization as well. So beer didn't last very long. It had to be sold right away. So what did the salesmen do? They sold it for whatever they could get for it, and it was bleeding the breweries dry. And the breweries tried to fix this. In Chicago, Milwaukee, brewers got together and they did a little pinky shake, and they agreed that no one would sell beer for less than $8 a barrel, and before the ink was dry, they were already violating it because that beer had to move. And the way that they solved this problem was they decided to own the bars. That was the way to do it. The brewery would own the bar, and then the brewery could tell the bar what the price of a barrel of beer was. And they called those tied houses. You probably have heard that term. They were called tied houses because they were economically tied to the brewery, either through ownership, direct ownership, or through lease. And this is a brewery in Milwaukee. I'm flying their flag right now, Wolski's Tavern. And Wolski's was built by Bernard Wolski in 1906 as a Pabst Tavern. So he signed a contract with Pabst. He agreed to only sell Pabst beer there. So they had one brand. And in exchange for that, Pabst bought him this bar set that was produced by Brunswick, Vulcan, and Collender. They were the largest maker of back bars in the United States. And this one was called the Lucky Baldwin. These were expensive pieces. They cost far more than people's houses. They might cost $7,000, $10,000. And tavern owners didn't have the money to buy that, but the brewers did. And the brewers were willing to do that because once that tavern is owned by the brewery or is exclusive to their brand, it's branded with the brewery. So Pabst gave Bernard Wolski back bar, front bar, glasses, signs, tables, chairs, everything to fit it out, and it became a Pabst brand. They don't want that looking like a dump. Like, they don't want a dive bar representing their brand, even though Miller now seems to like to celebrate dive bars. So they were willing to spend that huge expenditure of money. Brunswick, Vulcan, Collender, they designed a lot of back bars, and after a while, Mark and I could pretty much just spot them when we walked in a bar. We're like, oh, there's one. The first slide that I showed you, the bar my grandfather's standing in, that's a Brunswick, Vulcan, Collender back bar in that bar.
How big were the barrels? How many gallons?
Oh, God.
I mean, were they big?
Yeah, you know, the size of a barrel. I don't remember exactly. I don't want to say because I'm going to get it wrong. So, things seemed like they were going on a good pace, right? But there was a little dirty secret related to alcohol, and that was all of the social ills that were created from people's excess consumption of alcohol. As we mentioned before, men drank before they went to work. The bar, the OK Tavern, that was, when that was built, that opened at 6 a.m. It opened at 6 a.m. so the workers at the lumber mill could go down and have some drinks before they went into work in the morning. Because there's nothing like big saws and heavy equipment and alcohol. They go together. And, you know, they would drink in the morning, they drink at break, they drink at lunch, they drink it in the afternoon. They'd go to the bar after work and drink. And some of them would drink up the paycheck and bring nothing home for the wife to support her family. If the wife complained, he could beat her. That wasn't against the law. And there was no treatment or help for alcoholics. There was no alcohol, there was no AA, there was no social safety net, there weren't food pantries, there was nothing to rely on, and people suffered because of alcohol. Families were destroyed just like they were destroyed today, with the exception that people drank 3 times as much alcohol then as they do now. So imagine the problems that we have right now if people were drinking 3 times as much alcohol on average. They were huge societal problems. And it was the women first who got organized and stood up against it. They got organized in the church, and they started doing protests and rallies, and you could see these women outside of a liquor store protesting. And they tried to pass temperance. They wanted to get rid of this problem by just getting rid of alcohol, period. But the problem with getting rid of alcohol was the government ran on alcohol tax. It was the largest revenue source at every level of government, and they couldn't figure out a way how to ban alcohol without just eliminating the essential services of government. And so they were ineffectual until the early 20th century, when eventually the progressives emerged. And progressives were people who wanted to create institutions that would help provide that safety message, like public libraries and free public education and things like that that would better the culture, better, replace the poor farms, make this insane asylum something that were humane, those kinds of things. But they didn't have money to do that, and this is at the same time that the robber barons are becoming unspeakably rich. The Elon Musks of their time are becoming fabulously wealthy and outside of the reach of government, and so they wanted to pass an income tax so some of that money could come from people who had more than enough money to spare, and some of it could come from everybody else, and we take that money and run services. But they couldn't get traction on that idea until they teamed up with the temperance people. The temperance people, and they said, we'll support each other's causes here. And they did a handshake deal on that, and that's how Prohibition passed. So this is a typical kind of propaganda piece that came out at the time. Vote wet or vote dry. Vote wet for the sake of fat German burgers. Vote dry for the sake of women and children. And Prohibition ended up becoming a law of the land with the passage of the 18th Amendment. And the consequences were dramatic. Brewing was the 5th largest industry in Milwaukee. So imagine if the 5th largest industry just closes down overnight, goes away. It's not just the brewers that are out of a job. All the brewery workers are out of a job. Pabst had 350 people who were called corkers, who just pounded corks in the top of a bottle after it was tapped. 350 corkers. That's the scale of the number of people that worked at breweries. And not only that, all the tavern owners were out of work. There were almost 2,000 taverns in Milwaukee. All the tavern owners are out of work. All the bartenders are out of work. All the equipment suppliers, people who grew grain, who grew hops, they were all out of work. It was a tremendous economic upheaval to get rid of it. And guess what? People decided they just weren't going to play along. And so cheating, a prohibition, became a huge thing. What happened to all the taverns? Thousands of taverns, all sitting vacant. What do you do with them? Well, you can put some tables and chairs in them, you can turn them into a restaurant. The number of restaurants increases dramatically during Prohibition. It increases by about 40% because there are all those properties sitting out there. And you know what? You can also, through the magic of Prohibition law, you can also turn that into a speakeasy. And the thing about the Prohibition law, we could spend the whole day just talking about Prohibition law, and it's amazingly complex and it's so interesting. But one of the huge loopholes in Prohibition enforcement was that you could not search a person in a tavern. If you're suspected of being a speakeasy, you cannot search a person without a search warrant for them specifically. So the servers could just sew a little pocket in the inside of their apron and keep the bottle right in there. And then walk up to you, could you want to sweeten up that lemonade a little bit? And so it was very easy in speakeasies to operate them openly, but keep the alcohol below the point where the feds would be able to get you. But the breweries tried to make a go of it somehow. This is a brewery in Black River Falls called Badger Beverage Company, and it produced a temperance beer, as the sign says, which was near beer. It was beer with it had the alcohol removed from that. They tried brewing near beer. It was never popular. People didn't like it. I think near beer is just becoming good to drink now. But it was terrible back then, and people didn't like it. Pabst made cheese. They manufactured furniture, because they have factories, right? The Schlitz made chewing gum and chocolate bars. And they all just did whatever they could do to try to survive Prohibition. But one of the things that kept the bigger brewers alive is they owned tide houses. Schlitz owned 700 of them. So those 700 vacant properties, Schlitz can rent out to someone else or sell so they can keep revenue coming in. That was an advantage that the smaller brewers didn't have. And you can see that because before Prohibition at its height, Wisconsin had about 460 breweries. After Prohibition ended, there were 72. So you can see there was a lot of collateral damage where smaller breweries just couldn't make it out. The image on the left-hand side is of a tavern in Oshkosh. It was called Kelwin's Saloon when it was built. And when Mark and I went to visit this, we walked in the front door and my first reaction was, what is all that tile doing on the front of the front bar? I've never seen tile like that before on a bar. And by the time I left, I thought, I bet this place was a pharmacy during Prohibition. And we did research, and sure enough, Mr. Kelwin bought a pharmacy license for $5 when Prohibition ended that he could use to sell legal alcohol by prescription from your doctor. Yeah. It was a major loophole in the Prohibition law. And we found an order slip of his during Prohibition where he's buying cases of whiskey from the Kentucky distillery. And alcohol was considered by some savvy marketers, I guess, to be medicinal. It was a medicinal aid, they classified it as. So that's why a doctor could write you a prescription for alcohol. This place on the right-hand side is Nelson's Hall. It's on Washington Island. So we all have Wisconsin on our hand, right? Washington Island's right here. And Nelson's Hall, Tom Nelson, who owned this, was a huge believer in the medicinal value of bitters. He drank a pint of bitters every day. And he lived to be 92. So just keep that in mind. And so he could, bitters was considered to be medicinal, even though it was 90 proof, it was considered to be medicinal. So he could just sell it openly over the bar, and he did. He sold shots of bitters, and if you go there today, you can still buy a shot of bitters. You can see she's pouring one out there for this man. And if you do that, you can join the Bitters Club, which I'd say is great. Join the Bitters Club. And then write something in the Bitters book. Because people write inscriptions that are hilarious. My favorite one was, not as bitter as my ex-wife. Tom, also being a smart, savvy businessman, got himself a liquor license, or a drugstore license too. You've probably all heard of Walgreens, right? Walgreens started Prohibition with a couple of drugstores in Chicago. By the end of Prohibition, they owned over 300. So it was a very lucrative proposition for drugstores to be involved in drugs. Prohibition didn't work out exactly the way they thought it was. That peace and happiness that was going to carry everyone into the future turned out to be a gangster-ridden mess. And the thing about Prohibition did two things very well. It made ordinary people into criminals, and it created organized crime. And by the late 1920s, people are getting their fill of that. And there are many people who think we need to go back to legalizing alcohol because it was much better when it was legal and when it was illegal. And so there's a lot of agitation happening. So much so that Wisconsin in 1928 passed a repeal of the Severson Act. The Severson Act was passed after Prohibition as Wisconsin's prohibition law. And the purpose of the law was to authorize local and state police to police prohibition. But by 1928, Wisconsin said, we're out of this mess, and they repealed the Severson Act. And that meant that alcohol was still illegal in Wisconsin until the repeal of Prohibition, but nobody was enforcing it anymore. The federal government had 40 prohibition officers in Wisconsin. There's 72 counties, right? Let's do the math there and figure out how effective these things were. They were not effective at all anymore. They just lost any means of controlling it. This bar here, the Casino Tavern in La Crosse, that was built in 1928. Surprise, surprise. They built a tavern when it was still illegal, but no one was enforcing that anymore. And it operated until speakeasy, until the removal of Prohibition with the passage of the 21st Amendment, in which case it became a legitimate bar. The casino, one of the lovely things about the casino is they have had a really funny sense of humor all through their life. And they ran newspaper ads that were hilarious, up to the present, almost to the present day. My favorite one was a picture during the Depression of this ramshackle house that was like falling down, and it said, the caption said, "Why pay your mortgage when you can spend your money at the casino?" And this is the inside of the casino, and the end of Prohibition signaled a change, a radical change in the way that taverns looked. Because before Prohibition, taverns were male-only spaces. There were no bar stools. The bars were just a straight run, and everybody stood at the bar. And women are probably wondering, well, why did they ban women from taverns, right? Well, if you were a woman and you were standing in a tavern before Prohibition, you were a prostitute. And upstairs was a bordello where you did your business. So you met your clients down on the first floor, you entertained them on the second floor, and that's why women would not be seen in a tavern. Most women wanted nothing to do with them, and many cities just banned women completely from taverns. And the exception to that is they may create a little room off the back of the tavern. You've probably all been in a tavern that had another little room where the pool table was that wasn't connected to the bar. You had to walk through a door to get to it, or through a doorway. That was the ladies' lounge. And ladies were allowed to come in the back entrance and families and go there, but they were not allowed to come into the bar room. And the bartender would go back and serve them, but they were not allowed into the tavern space. Well, after Prohibition ends, women are welcomed into taverns, and tavern owners and brewery owners welcome women. They see women as a way of ameliorating the negative impulses of men, and that by having women in taverns, it would mean that men would be tugged on the arm and told it's time to go home, honey. And they were also a source of income. And women had become enamored with drinking cocktails during Prohibition. Prohibition, the alcohol is awful, right? You've all heard of rot gut gin and bathtub gin, rot gut whiskey. Those were descriptions of the really awful alcohol that was on the market during Prohibition, because they would put anything in alcohol. They'd sometimes even put formaldehyde in alcohol, if you can imagine that. And so it was terrible. Well, how do you drink terrible alcohol? You don't drink it by the shot. You mix it with soda, put some fruit in it, you come up with some spicy concoction, and you give it a name. And so during Prohibition, alcohol recipe books just take off like crazy. Many of them are published, and they have funny little names like What Drinks for Dries and stuff like that. They make a lot of fun of the whole alcohol culture. But people get a taste for that. Women start going to speakeasies because there's a revolution in a women's revolution happening during Prohibition, where women are throwing off the shackles of their Victorian mothers, and they're bobbing their hair, they're smoking cigarettes, they're wearing slinky dresses, they're dancing the scandalous Charleston. You know, they're freeing themselves. And part of that freedom was the freedom to go to speakeasies and listen to that naughty jazz music and, all of that. So when all of that ends, women are welcomed into taverns, but taverns have to change as a result of it. And the most dramatic change is the bar stool is introduced. Because women don't want to stand all night, they want to be able to sit down. But once you park people along the bar, that long straight bar, not as good as it used to be, because if you want to talk to a person 2 stools down, you got to do this, or you got to do this. It inhibits conversation. So they curve the bar. They start curving them so that there's easier conversation. They also create specialized spaces for couples, cocktail booths, where couples can meet other couples and drink cocktails together. What happens after World War II? Well, probably the most dramatic change for taverns was the introduction, or the widespread adoption of the automobile. And the automobile changes taverns tremendously, because taverns clientele before that time were walk-ins. They were generally people who walked to the neighborhood tavern to drink and then crawled home, I guess. And but once you're in a car, it changes the dynamics for taverns, because taverns are able to establish a market of people that is a niche. They're able to attract specific customers, because those people are willing to drive a ways to get to a tavern. So taverns become themed, and we all know themed taverns today. There are all sorts of them. There are NASCAR bars, there are sports bars, there are fern bars, gay bars. You could go down the list. There are lots of different kinds of bars that are all marketing to a specific niche of people. And this is an early one in Milwaukee. Does anybody know this one, first off? Can anybody recognize it? That's it, because it's secret. It's the Safe House.
The Safe House.
Yes. And the entrance to the Safe House is off of an alley in Milwaukee. And there is no sign for the bar. The sign just says what it says right in this photo. It says International Exports Limited. And you got to know what door to go to, and you walk in, you open the door, you walk in, and you're in this space that kind of looks like a study. And there's no signs of how to get in the bar. And a little trap door will open and they'll ask you for the password, which I'm not going to tell you because the fun is not knowing the password. But if you don't know it, they'll make you do the chicken dance or a Macarena or something. And little do you know as you're doing that they're broadcasting that on closed circuit throughout the entire tavern. So once you get through the door, you've already made friends. And it was established by a couple who were fascinated with Cold War spying. You know, Man from U.N.C.L.E., Get Smart, James Bond, all that espionage stuff. They thought it was just brilliant, so they designed the tavern to be a series of little rooms that talk about places of espionage in the past. This is the Hanoi Hilton here, depicted in that bar. This is another example of a very niched bar. This is a military bar in Waterford, Wisconsin. It's called the DMC Bunker, Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, I'm sorry. And the guys that started this, they were Vietnam vets. There were 3 of them. They decided to get together and make a bar, and they thought they would make it military themed because they were all non-vets and they thought that sounded like fun. So they took their military stuff and they hung it up on the inside of the bar, and they camo netted the inside, they camo netted the outside, they sandbagged it. They started acquiring all these surplus military vehicles. They have tanks and jet planes and helicopters and a MASH tent and a POW watchtower, and there's ordnance buried in the ground. It's just chock full inside and out of this stuff. And they said when they opened it up, the fascinating thing that they didn't expect is people started bringing in their family stuff. Dad just died, and he was a World War II vet. We don't know what to do with this stuff. Are you willing to take it? Sure, give it to us. Our son died in Vietnam. We'd like to hang up a picture of him. Would you hang his picture on the wall? Sure, we'll do that. And so that's how their collection grew, just from the kindness of all the patrons.
Where is it?
It's in Waterford, which is just a little bit northwest of Racine. This is the last bar I'm going to talk about. This is, anybody ever been here? It's Tom's Burnt Down Cafe, and it's on Madeline Island. So it's another bar. You gotta take a ferry boat to get there. You've been there.
We were by there. It was closed.
Oh.
I went there about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
We went and we finished with the last ferry back to the mainland. And got stuck out there for the night.
Yes, it's worth the ferry trip. It really is. And the story behind Tom's is that Tom bought a cafe. It was called Leona's Cafe. And he put it up on logs and he rolled it across the island because he wanted to be closer to where the ferry boat landed. And he started working on it. He built a deck on the back of it. And he started working on the building and it caught fire and it burned to the ground. And the next day, Tom comes, he drives his car over there, and he's sorting through the ash trying to see if there's anything he can salvage out of it. The only thing that's left is the deck. And his beer truck arrives, which has come over on the ferry boat, full of beer for Tom. So he opens the trunk of his car and he just puts it in the trunk. And he decides to just set up a couple folding chairs on the deck and go back into business. And that's Tom's. The deck's gotten bigger as he's gotten a little more success. The car is still there if you know where to look for it. They built the deck over the top of it and you have to look through the slats in the board. You can see the car down in there if you want to know that. And a few years ago he got really fancy and he bought a used tent from the Chautauqua up there and put a tent over it, so now you don't have to sit in the rain and drink. Two of the times I was in there, the person sitting next to me on the bar stool was a dog. So it's really an interesting place. And it's covered with all the signage. My very favorite one is this one, for sale by neighbor. And if you knew people on the island, you'd know that's not really all that untruthful. My second favorite one is, as you walk out, you see one that says, "The last one here, turn off Tom." Also very true. Okay, so here's shameless promotion. I'm going to promote the book that Mark and I did. I brought copies to sell. They're $25. I can take cash or a check. And I'm willing to promote this because I don't make a penny off this book. I donate all the revenue to the Wisconsin Historical Society. So if you buy a book, if you don't buy a book, I'm not going to cry. And if you buy a book, I'm going to thank you for supporting the Historical Society. Okay, that's the end. And before we take questions, oops, we're going to go to this slide here. And my overlords of the Wisconsin Historical Society want to know what you think. So if you're willing to fill out that a survey there, just say phenomenal, spectacular. You know, if you can't think of the words, come to me. I'll help you with that. But with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments that people have. I'm always looking for great bars, so if you know where there's a really, really excellent bar, I want to hear it.
Well, all these buds and blooms remind me that Earth Day is coming up in April, as is Easter. We hope to see you seeing us again next week and every week.